It's hard to think of a more multifaceted and loaded word, right, than the word justice. We all use it in different ways. We modify it, we qualify it, we seek it, we decry the lack of it. Today, we'll break down at least two concepts: retributive justice and restorative justice. Retributive justice, an eye for an eye, if you will, a type of justice based on punishment for wrongdoing. This form of justice is most commonly associated with our nation's criminal justice system. How does retributive justice exacerbate institutional, systemic, and structural inequities? Then there's restorative justice, a model of justice which tries to repair harm and restore relationships. What are the benefits and limits of this approach? The Baltimore Sun editorial board asked this morning in an editorial reflecting on Tuesday, what would restorative justice look like? It was a timely question for our conversation this afternoon. Is it possible to push the boundaries of restorative justice beyond its current principles, strategies, and practices, reimagining it in a way that yields systemic benefits? With that, let us launch poll number 2. My level of understanding of restorative justice, and we're asking you to choose one of these. None to a little, very basic, or somewhat advanced. So it looks like the majority here have a basic understanding. And I know our panelists will be eager to explore these concepts further. Before we begin, for those who are social media inclined, we very much invite you to extend the reach of this community of practice and to involve others, draw others into the important conversations that we're having today. The hashtag is HCHMD community. HCHMD community, and our Twitter handle, our handle in general is @HCHomeless. We ask that you use the Twitter and the hashtag in your social media work. This will remain constant throughout all of our community of practice conversations. There will be live polls like the 2 that you just took throughout the session. They're completely anonymous. Please participate. It helps inform our panelists and each other about our shared level of understanding or our beliefs and opinions as we go through the session today. What brings us here today? A year and a half ago, in the before times, it seems like, when we could actually gather in person, 150 people came together at the Reginald F. Lewis Museum in downtown Baltimore for a day-long community convening on homelessness, where we brought together an intentionally diverse array of individuals and organizations who don't always work together for a conversation about homelessness and why it persists. At the conclusion of that day-long gathering, many asked, so what? What next? How do we further these conversations? Always having conversations towards shared understanding and collective action. Then, of course, came a global pandemic that painfully revealed every structural inequity we had been discussing. Then came the knee of law enforcement on the neck of George Floyd. We've had 4 topics thus far in our almost year-long community of practice: race and health, race, housing and health, policing and community trust, food insecurity, race and access, and today, reimagining restorative justice through the lens of eliminating structural racism. Before we introduce our panelists, I want to open with these powerful words spoken by 23-year-old Amanda Gorman, the Youth Poet Laureate of the United States, during this year's presidential inauguration. I'm seeing some smiles. Do you remember when you heard these words? I'm not going to at all do justice, if you will, to her reading of it, but I ask that you bear with me. Where were you when you heard these words? When day comes, we ask ourselves, Where can we find light in this never-ending shade? The loss we carry, a sea we must wade. We've braved the belly of the beast. We've learned that quiet isn't always peace, and the norms and notion of what just isn't always justice. We've learned that quiet isn't always peace, and the norms and notions of what just isn't always justice. Gordon's entire poem is a bold declaration of who we are as a country, who we can be, and the hope we can achieve if we are, quote, brave enough to see, and, quote, be the light that shines upon the shades of our injustice. In our quest for democracy and true freedom for all people, what does justice look like? And how do we truly achieve it? As Gorman states, the status quo of what just is not always fair, or it's fair to some, while unfair, unjust, and even absolutely unbearable for others. What then is our role in reimagining justice in a manner that challenges the status quo, works for everyone, creates equity? This includes reimagining justice, frankly, in our interpersonal relationships, justice in the institutions we inhabit daily, maybe the institutions we lead, justice in the systems that are supposed to protect us and enforce our legal codes, such as the criminal justice system. Despite Tuesday's verdict, the shades of injustice still overshadow and empowers the moral fabric, and overpowers rather the moral fabric of our nation. Can we move from the fatigue of despair to the buoyancy of hope? The words of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., to ensure that justice rolls down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. Will we work collectively to eliminate the racial, health, and justice barriers that hurt not just our communities most in need, but harm us all? Who holds the power to institute change? How do we hold those in power accountable to ensure that the changes are implemented? How do we ensure that power is seeded and redistributed equitably? The basic order today is much more like a fireside chat than a panel. There will be links in the chat box in real time, the question and answer at the bottom of your screen, and interactive polls. The basic order will be a question for all speakers, and I'll invite you to introduce yourselves within the context of that question, while also perhaps sharing with us where you are following Tuesday's verdict. We'll have a question and answer session from participants, so make sure that if you have questions, share them in the Q&A. Some final remarks at the very end, and we'll wrap up and talk about where we're going. Now, let me introduce our speakers today. I'm extremely excited by this group of panelists today for a conversation, especially this week. Monique Brown, Lieutenant Colonel of the Baltimore City Police Department. Welcome, Lieutenant Colonel Brown. Bishop Kevin Daniels, a fellow social worker, associate professor at Morgan State University and pastor of St. Martin Church of Christ. Tara Andrews Huffman, she and I were just reflecting that we've known each other for many, many years now and are not aging a day. She's an attorney and director of criminal and juvenile justice program at Open Society Institute in Baltimore. And John T. Bullock, Doc Bullock, as many of us know him in person and on Twitter, Baltimore City Council representative of the 9th District. It's an honor to have each of you here today. I'm going to ask each of you to begin with the exact same question. You'll each have about 4 minutes for each response. I will likely blink my mute button off and on when we're getting close to that end period, if that's a helpful guide. And we ask again that you introduce yourself within the context of answering this question and possibly describe how you're feeling after Tuesday's verdict. In her book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, I believe the link will be shared in the chat box. Encourage this very challenging book. Dr. Michelle Alexander describes the current criminal justice system as, quote, the rebirth of a caste-like system in the United States that's resulted in millions of African Americans locked behind bars and then relegated to a permanent second-class status. Even with proposed and implemented reforms in criminal justice, racial inequities continue to persist. For so many individuals, to be Black in America has been directly equated with being identified as a criminal, as threatening. Ongoing consequences of these inequities for people of color include increased police profiling, prolonged incarceration, homelessness, and even death. Using your own personal and professional lenses, will you tell us why racism, even in a reformed criminal justice system, is so difficult to identify, confront, and address? Why is racism in the criminal justice system so difficult to identify, confront, and address? Lieutenant Colonel Brown, let's turn to you with that question.
Good afternoon, Kevin, and thank you for having me here again on this panel, and definitely for a very good discussion. I would say that I think that racism is hard to address, identify and confront, because we have many who are very ambitious, in some of the, and maybe in some of their career paths, right? So I would say for us, as the Baltimore Police Department, that we have had different administrations that have used us as strategies and initiatives to meet those ambitions. And with that comes the fact that we're no longer policing where there's still humility at the framework. We're policing now to make sure that we are, allowing this, whomever that administration is, to catapult themselves into a national spotlight, to be recognized and say, hey, listen, I was tough on crime. I was able to make this reduction in numbers by doing this many arrests. But in the entrance of that, what we did was destroyed our relationship with community. What we did was, negatively impact a lot of our community members where they were already on a very good positive pathway. Now we cause them to have a negative pathway by introducing them to the criminal justice system for very minor offenses that we should have never been policing them for in the first place.
Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel. Let's turn to Reverend Dr. Daniels. Why is racism, even in a reformed criminal justice system, so difficult to identify, confront, and address?
Well, I think that what's critical, can you hear me?
Sure can.
I think that what is critical is the fact that it's so, and most of us already know that, but it is already, it is so historically baked and saturated into policies, practices, and procedures. And it is totally because it's become a part of the very culture itself as it relates to structural, institutional, systemic. It is already baked into it. And I'll use as a story, because even Michelle Alexander, when she talked about the fact it has become a form of mass incarceration, has become a form of racial and social control. As she talked about locked up for periods of time, and that has become a challenge. I'll use for a story. I'll never forget getting my PhD and leaving Morgan State University, had my car driving over 25th Street and several police cars stopped me. About 10 police cars stopped me. I was in a BMW. They had no idea I got it from my school refund money. They had no idea, none of that. But again, I was a proud BMW driver. I'll never forget on 25th Street, they pulled me over, and several officers got out of the car, and they happened to be white officers. They got out of the car, and their guns were already cocked, so to speak, and they threw me up against the car. And immediately began to wait for another fellow white officer at that time. And the first thing they asked her was, "Is this the one that pointed the gun at you?" And she looked at me very closely and walked up to me and said, "It looks like him, but it's not him." And there they left me right there. I felt totally disrespected. Again, and I guess the what I would say is the problem is we look like everybody else. And without that kind of micro look into people's, as far as their dignity, respect, and their humanity, they had no idea I was the first in my family to get a PhD and a degree, period. They had no idea of what it took for me to even get the car. They didn't spend that kind of time, relational time, to really understood because I look like everybody else. And until we deal with that theme of looking like everybody else, I think that we're going to be what we call disproportionately, as far as retributive justice is concerned. It is not proportional to where everybody is.
As you said, Dr. Daniels, it has all been historically baked. So the ingredients used in the cupcake, if you will, already predisposed the kind of reaction the kind of interaction that you described.
Yeah. No, it becomes critical because the trend is in the 70s, 60s, and the 70s, you start to look at sentencing from judicial and executive level, but then from the 70s and beyond, you start to look at it from a more legislative impact, and there you start to see more retributive kind of things taking place, but it was not proportional to what people have done. Again, I still wear the scars of that trauma. From being thrown up against the car. Every time I drive past 25th Street, I'm always looking behind me to see whether or not I would be pulled over. And that happened several years ago, but it still lives in perpetuity in my mind.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Dr. Daniels. Tara Huffman, let's turn to you. Using both your personal and professional lenses, can you tell us why racism, even in a reformed criminal justice system, is so difficult to identify, confront, and address?
So I won't repeat what's already been said. I'll just add an exclamation point behind everything that's already been said and then add a couple of more things. One, I think because the criminal justice system is currently built as a retributive justice system, and it's also a system that has been equated with safety. The more robust the criminal justice is, then the safer we're supposed to be. In addition to the fact that this is a nation that still is very uncomfortable with its racist origins in history and does not want to talk about that, you add to it the element that, if someone's coming in contact with the justice system, it's because they have allegedly done something wrong. And if you particularly take that the wrong that they've done has harmed another person or their property, if I'm seeking some sort of justice or recompense from being harmed or from the loss of property, I'm not interested in having a conversation about racism. I'm not interested in having a conversation about the disproportionate impact of the justice system on a particular group of people, right? I want to be righted, right? I want the wrong that has been done to me to be made right. And so I don't have the patience for conversations about racism and how my pursuit of justice is actually perpetuating racism. I mean, I certainly don't want to have a conversation about the fact that my pursuit of justice may actually be driven by racism and by my own biases against people of a certain race, ethnicity, national origin, so on and so forth. And so the issue of being avenged of the harm that's been done to me, and the issue of safety. You know, the police are there to keep me safe, and we put people in jail and the prison because they're dangerous, and so we want to be safe. So the issues of being avenged or wrong being righted and safety get conflated and get mixed up in, you know, these very racist institutions and this racist system, and folks just lack either the wherewithal sometimes, they lack the patience, they lack the compassion to be able to pull that apart and, you know, have a conversation about how can the wrong be made right, and how can I reach a place of safety that is outside of this racist structural, this system that is rife with structural racism. It's the only system I know. It's the only system I can see. It's the system that my tax dollars are being spent in, you know, increments of billions of dollars every single year. So this is what I got, right? So this is what I got. This is what I'm going to use. And even as I'm on my own race journey, I may be on my own journey of race and race consciousness and becoming conscious about white dominant culture and white privilege and white supremacy. I've been wronged and I want to be safe. And this system is the only one I know. And so when I'm looking for some sort of personal satisfaction, a sense of personal safety, I'm going to continue to rely on it, even if my journey is telling me that there's something wrong with it. So then I say, well, we'll just fix it. Right. And that's why our reformed system still keeps perpetuating this, because you can't reform something that is rotten from the core. The only thing you can do with it is dismantle it and build something entirely different in its place.
Can't reform something that is rotten. And something else that really stayed with me here, Tara, my pursuit of justice is perpetuating racism. And you've worked for a very long time now, decades, at reforming the current system. And you seem at the point where it's not reformable as currently designed.
Yeah, and I appreciate you lifting that up, because yes, when I started out into this, you know, that would have been back in 2000, when I first joined the Public Justice Center as a staff attorney. And then got involved in juvenile justice and then adult justice. I was reform. I used the name reform all the time. And it was early in my reformist career that I met people from Critical Resistance and other organizations who were using abolitionist language. Like, no, we want to abolish the whole thing. You know, and in my mid to late 20s and even into my early 30s and late 30s, I thought the idea of abolition was crazy. I was like, what are you talking about? You can't get rid of the police. Like, we're always going to need police. We're always going to need prisons. We're always going to need jails. We just need to figure out how to make them work. But I can tell you that, you know, 20 something years in, I have evolved where I know I'm in the abolitionist camp now. I finally understand the abolitionist theory of change and framework. Abolitionists are not calling they're not calling that we get rid of prisons and these institutions tomorrow. They're calling that we create a world where these things become obsolete. And that's where our focus is. How do we create a world where your knee jerk isn't to call the police? And to your point, and we'll get into it later, how do we create a world where we understand that we're not seeking retribution, I'm actually seeking restoration. Yes. Right. And I'm seeking reconnection, and I'm seeking some level of reconciliation. I won't step on Dr. Daniels' things anymore, but that's what I've come to understand, that's what it is to be an abolitionist. It isn't, I want to get rid of it all tomorrow, because I understand that the world that we have today won't sustain that. But it's, what do I do on a daily basis to create a world where the thing that we're so reliant on, we actually come to find that thing to be obsolete and not the way we want to do it anymore.
And we will indeed, as you say, get into this further. Thank you, Ms. Tara Huffman. Let's turn to Councilman John Bullock. Same question, using your own personal and professional lenses. Will you tell us why racism, even in a reformed criminal justice system, is so difficult to identify, confront, and address?
Absolutely, and I appreciate the question. And in some ways, I'm going to sound like a professor. In some ways, I'm going to sound like a policymaker. And in some ways, a Black man with lived experience as a father and a brother as well. And so, if you go back to the beginning of the country and you think about the Declaration of Independence, a lot of people are familiar with the phrase of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. However, in the first draft, it was actually life, liberty, and property. And so when you start thinking about property and the fact that at the beginning of the country, the Black people were essentially property. And so now you look at a system where you have Black folks being freed from slavery, but at the same time, we see the attempts to incarcerate Black folks for slave labor and for also from minor infractions. Even if you start looking at how policing has occurred throughout the years, again, even think about the first movie shown in the White House was Birth of a Nation, and it shows the Klan as this avenging, saving force, protecting white womanhood and Christianity in America. And so the perceptions of who are criminals has really been, not to overuse this term, but baked into the cake, if you will. And so thinking about who the perceptions are, right, in terms of Black men and Black boys, Black women, Black bodies, period. And so the reality is that folks in our communities, I'll talk about growing up in West Philadelphia, representing West Baltimore. The fact is that many of our folks have either been victims of crime, have been, in some cases, perpetrators of a crime, and deal with the trauma involved with all of that and the destabilization of communities. And so when you start looking at the issue of racism and discrimination, how folks look at it, again, if the perception is that folks of color are going to be criminals, then you look at the dehumanization, whether it's a knee on the neck, whether it's a shot in the chest, whether it's being locked up in large numbers for very minor infractions. And so everyone around this table has talked about, how policing has happened in Baltimore, how the criminal justice system has worked, especially if you're poor, right? If you're poor and guilty or poor and innocent, it works better for you if you're actually rich and guilty, right? And so these are some of the challenges we deal with in terms of perceptions of who is a victim, who's a perpetrator, what they look like. And one part that was also mentioned before, which I thought was really important, is also relationships. And so it's easy to dehumanize folks and put them into boxes or categories when you lack the relationships and the understanding from a person-to-person point of view. And I think conversations like this are really important to break down those barriers, given what we're dealing with in our city and our country as a whole. So I know we'll get deeper into these issues as well, but again, I appreciate the opportunity to discuss them because this is way past time to deal with the issues that are in our hearts and our minds and affecting our communities.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Councilman Bullock, and appreciate you showing up in this space, as you do in so many spaces, with all of your identities, as a professor and as a councilman, as a father, as a Black man with lived experience. Thank you for bringing that all to this conversation. Let me turn to back to you, Dr. Daniels, for this next question. Our criminal justice system employs, as we've been talking about, retributive justice toward those who offend, a type of justice that administers a punishment, incarceration, consequence for wrongdoing, rooted back into, as we said in the very beginning, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. This idea asserts that punishment serves as an effective deterrent for a crime against the state, places the responsibility of the crime on the individual, and promotes that the punishment should ultimately change an offender's behavior. Given the realities of racial inequities that exist and are pervasive or baked in, as you say, into the criminal justice system, do you find such an approach to be effective? If not, what's an alternative?
Well, and again, thank you. The reason that it has not been effective, we've seen that in our data. We've seen it down several years as it relates to, I said it earlier, the level of proportionality of punishment and or who, when you talk about retributive, you talk about incapacitation, several of those things. And when you talk about locking people up, We've seen that disproportionality in our criminal justice system. Not only when you lock them up, is it a cost to lock people up? It disrupts family, it disrupts workforce, all of those things. And when you look at deterrence and all of those kind of things, most of that, we call it rational choice theory, because you think that if you bring a deterrent towards somebody, that somewhere along the line, the cost benefit analysis of it is going to shift their ability to do any type of crime. And we've seen down through the years, we can just look within our last 4 years, how crime is disproportionately, when you start to look at white collar crime that took place, even with those on a federal level versus those on a local level, you start to see that disproportionality, and it has not been equal to that extent. Even when you look at our city, I just did some research for the consent decree, all of that. When you start to look at in 2019 and also recently in 2020, as we went across 14 districts, and we began to talk to people and to ask them questions across those districts, not only community, but also police officers as well. Even police officers said in 2019 with the consent decree, and we spent valuable time with several of them across 9 police districts. Even they talked about the disproportionality, but yet their fear in being able to not share anything because of the consequences that might happen within their blue wall. So again, even they shared the kind of criminality that takes place within that somehow doesn't allow for them to also provide justice as well. Baltimore City, you start to look at the black butterfly versus the white L. All of those things that disproportionately somehow or another works against people of color within our community. So when you start to talk about, and a part of even my own incident with the police officers on 25th Street, I turned it, as we start looking at alternatives, I turned that into a healing moment. And most of my work has been poured into criminal justice as it relates to also looking at approaches that are multi-dosed approaches, that you can't just divvy it down from the top to the bottom. It's got to come up from the bottom to the top, and there needs to be an agreement upon what justice looks like between all parties. So when you start to talk about what approaches to look at, I'll never forget, after Freddie Gray, we were called upon at Morgan State University to provide some veteran and cadet training. We talked about, we didn't lecture them as much as we talked about, we touched their humanity, we touched their humanness. Everybody was in the room, the students were in the room, the officers were in the room. We talked about intergenerations. We talked about cultural competence and what that looks like. And what we found is that we don't know each other. We provide a service to people that we don't know, or we don't get the time to spend with them. And that is just not, that is building relationships and community organizing is 101, so to speak. You have to know how to build. Community engagement deals with long-term relationships. You can't take officers out of an area and expect them to build relationships. All of the communities talked about that. We brought an approach to the consent decree, and what we did was we talked to community first, then we talked to officers second. Same questions. Then we brought both groups together, and what we found was nothing but a good old town hall family meeting that went over, because each group had an ability to see each other and hear each other's humanity. What do the officers do on their time off? Again, all of that became critical, and we just had a good old therapy session there. But I think if we want to look at approaches, we have to look at a multi-dosed approach. We offered the EpiCrim model, which is public health, that looks at public health and crime and bring it together. So again, I think that it needs to be all of us involved in the process of towards that healing. Like myself, I used that incident that could have been very pathological for me. I used that as an opportunity to create healing, not only between myself and officers, but also my work has been poured into looking at community as well. But as long as I don't think retributive policies will work in and of themselves, because we've seen down through the years that they will not work and they can't work. We're watching it right now, even as we start talking on the federal level. After all that's going on in this country, why is qualified immunity still an issue in the Senate at this particular time? Something is wrong with that. It's not even constitutional. So again, I think that at some point we need to begin to really look at what we want America to really look like, and specifically what we want Baltimore to look like. I've had a wonderful opportunity to work with Lieutenant Colonel Brown, all of that. And I think once those relationships are built, I think that becomes something extremely critical for an approach as we move forward. We're on our way incrementally.
Yes, I'm so glad to hear about the power of those relationships locally, because on the national level and on the airwaves, it's certainly not creating those spaces. But to hear that happening on a local level, and hopefully at local levels all across the country, is inspiring and dare I say hopeful. Let me turn to you, Lieutenant Colonel Brown. I want to give you the opportunity to respond to Dr. Daniels. What are your thoughts on his perspectives? What would such alternative approaches look like? What would such alternative approaches look like when homelessness itself is criminalized? I shared with you in the prep call a wonderful moment a year and a half ago at that community convening where you were on a panel. I don't know if you remember this. One of our board members who himself experienced homelessness, who was arrested, incarcerated for doing things that you do when you don't have a place to go, loitering, public urination, literally not having a place to go. And he was so inspired by your reflections on breaking down retributive justice that he stood up in the middle of the session and asked you for a hug. It was a very important moment. So what are your thoughts in response to Dr. Daniels? How do we re-envision responses to homelessness that themselves have been criminalized? I appreciate your thoughts.
So I still share those same sentiments from the very first panel that you invited me to. And I agree wholeheartedly with Dr. Daniels. You know, what we tried to do in the police department was arrest our way out of some of these social economic issues and problems without having any real problem solving mechanism to look at it to say, hey, listen, what happens? How much harm do I cause to someone? You know, how much negative impact will this have if we make these arrests and put, you know, individuals who are clearly in some different type of a need into a criminal justice system? You know, I think that now through our reform, we are learning that how much harm we caused. We need more, you know, alternatives, just as Dr. Daniels is saying, that connects those individuals to services and resources that is a need for them, and not necessarily trying to criminalize every single thing that they do. I still do believe that all of us are just one incident and just one injury away from experiencing homelessness ourselves. I think COVID has been one of those things that has impacted us all to let us know, hey, wait a minute, we need to take a gauge on ourselves to see how close we are, 1 foot in and 1 foot out of the door, where we feel as though we are more secure because we do have some stabilization, or at least we have the appearance of stabilization. So I do think that we most certainly need to start working more to getting to the root of why someone may be in the situation that they are, and figuring out what services, what resources, what community-based group that we can absolutely connect them to. Now, even though this is more so about homelessness, but right now I'm working on a youth diversion program that will do absolutely what we're saying. An alternative to 911 where we empower community, you know, we build that capacity. Hey, listen, we see young people that's engaged in some risky behavior, but instead of us calling 911, let me call this community-based group that I know this young person has an interest in and we can divert them away from the criminal justice system. So I do think that we need absolutely the same. We do need alternatives to 911. We do need to impact our community and empower them to let them know that, listen, 911 is there, but we should not use 911 as social work. We shouldn't use them as mental health professionals. We should not use them as a connection for resource if we know that someone is in need of food, because food insecurity is huge. And we certainly should not use it for our young people that we know. If it was us, we've done those same things. The only thing that is missing is we don't have those adults around us to say, hey, listen, that's not an okay thing to do. And not the parent support to say, thank you for stopping my child from doing this one particular thing, and thank you for not calling the police. So I do still sit right in my same sentiment. Homelessness is not a crime. And what we should be doing is making sure that we are getting to the root of maybe why that individual is experiencing homelessness and try to connect them to as much services and wrap around and support them as best we can.
I said that to you. I said it to you earlier, Kevin, in our board meeting, and you got a nice name too, Kevin. I said it earlier.
We have to stick together, Kevin.
I said it in our board meeting earlier. I'll never forget when I was working for Johns Hopkins on the homeless unit, and my father. I go down and assess homeless community. And I go down and when I did that under the viaduct, I'll never forget, and I said it this morning, I went down and in doing the assessment, I saw my father under the bridge. We had lost contact with him. We had lost contact. I hadn't seen him in several years, and come to find out this vibrant Black man that gave me all the style that I have and pushed me to Morgan, gave me $100 and said, go to Morgan. Do the best that you can. And he was one of my clients when I went to do the homeless population, and he was getting ready to get locked up that day for being homeless. And I intervened. It was and again, I'll say this it was my own father that I literally found underneath of the bridge, and it has changed. And then I started to wonder, what got him? What were the factors that led to this moment in time? Homeless, mentally ill, all of those things. What are the factors that lead to that? He did not need prison. He needed service.
And I agree with you, Dr. Daniels. If I can just share one more thing, Kevin.
Please do.
My 15-year-old self, I grew up in East Baltimore with my mom, who was experiencing substance abuse. But that was her way to cope, because my dad had been killed by his brother when I was just barely 3 after an argument between my mom and my dad. Now, clearly she wanted him to get away, or separate herself, but not to be murdered, So instead of my family wrapping her around with all of the mental health support that she needed as a young teenage mom, she found other ways to cope with that. So I found myself looking for her in vacant homes where I knew that she would go in, of course, purchase her drugs from, and would have to go in, even before I was in this role professionally, kick in doors to drag her out to say, what are you doing here? So I definitely know how you feel, because to see them in that experiencing is just like, where did we go wrong? And I know what the root is, but how do we fix it? So I've always kept that with me passionately. Homelessness is not that thing that we should be roaming around saying, hey, we're locking everyone up. It causes more harm than anything. We should be making sure that we're wrapping around the right resources that is needed.
Well, Lieutenant Colonel, what you're sharing and what you, Dr. Daniels, shared, you, Lieutenant Colonel, you referenced earlier something that you said wasn't directly related to homelessness. It's all related to homelessness. It's related to failed systems and structural racism that result in homelessness. Dr. Daniels, I shared with you this morning after you shared that, and I appreciate you sharing that here. You mentioned his love of hats, and I asked you his first name, and I knew your father.
Hey, look, it's right here. You got the hat right here.
And our previous CEO knew your father, and we were talking about that.
Wow.
I asked him if he remembered the name as well, and he said he always wore hats.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, he was very respected by clients of our organization. Let's turn back to you, Doc Bullock. Councilman, I want to build on or maybe delve a little deeper into this idea of retributive justice and introduce the concept of restorative justice. Whereas retributive or criminal justice focuses on crime as a violation of the state, restorative justice focuses on crime as a violation of people and of relationships. We've all been talking about the importance of relationships. Whereas criminal justice requires the state to determine culpability and impose the correct punishment, restorative justice involves victims, offenders, and community members in an effort to repair harm and put things right. Given these two different types of justice and the complexities of crime and structural racism in Baltimore, which form of justice is most effective? Should restorative justice replace our criminal justice system, were it to be that easy? Should it be institutionalized as a complement to the current system?
So, wow, it's just a very heavy question again.
That's a heavy question.
When you think about, the criminal justice system as currently stipulated, you think about reformatories or penitentiaries, right? That there's supposed to be some penance involved and some reformation. But what's happened over time is they've essentially been places where people have been warehoused. And to the points that were made by both the previous speakers, with a lack of services, mental health, education, substance abuse, that would allow people to come out into communities and be assets as opposed to being detriments. One piece that I'll say before getting even further into restorative justice, I'll just say this. Before we were just talking about homelessness and not being criminal, and it's not criminal. What has been criminal is our policies that have been anti-poor. And if you look at wages, the lack of an increase in the minimum wage, you look at lack of benefits as it relates to healthcare, housing, the lack of affordable housing. And so all these issues conspire to put people in very dangerous and precarious situations. Now, when we talking about justice, it's also about repairing relationships. I'll give this great example. We have a wonderful service provider in our district. I'll name it the Turk House, for instance. And one of the programs they had was actually a clean and green program where we had people who had substance abuse issues, and some of them have been formerly incarcerated, who are now coming out to help repair the communities that they injured in the past. So helping to clean out alleys, working with some of the seniors as well. I think there's some models of how we repair those relationships. Again, how can some of those folks also be models of what could be possible? I look at the Safe Streets program where we have people who are violence interrupters. Some of them, have walked that path in terms of being out on the streets and doing some negative activities, but have reformed their lives and saying to young people and even not so young people that there's another way that we can go. So I'm definitely more of the restorative justice piece. I do think there are times, again, where folks may need to be removed from the community to get time to have those kinds of services and an intense environment. But we have to really be thinking about what kind of communities are we creating for people and what kind of communities they're returning to. And I say this, as one who has had family members who have been incarcerated and who've come out and struggled with addiction and unemployment. And oftentimes coming back to the same communities that victimized them, put them in a situation where they wound up becoming perpetrators. So if you want to improve the environment, you have to then deal with folks who are behind those walls. And when they come out, making sure they have opportunities for jobs, for healthcare, for relationship building. Some of it's going to be mental health. Some of it's going to be engagement in houses of worship, regardless of that faith. And I will say also that our religious institutions could also play a significant role with that in helping to be one of those neutral sites that can gather people to be able to, be on one accord and be able to have those kinds of conversations on a deep level and be able just to repair some of that harm and address some of that trauma that's happened over time.
That's absolutely. Thank you, Councilman Bullock. And you're really asking, how is it that we create sustainable communities?
Right.
Not just not returning people back to communities, but rethinking what we mean about community in a way that they are sustainable and that people are supported in sustainable communities. I'd like to take the temperature of the group here with our next poll. And reflecting on our past conversation, I believe that the criminal justice system needs to be left as is, moderately reformed, strongly augmented by empowered neighborhood watch and patrol associations, completely deconstructed and reimagined, replaced with a restorative justice system, as we've been discussing. Let's give that some time. And what are your thoughts as these come in, Councilman? We're seeing completely destructed and reimagined.
I tend to be on the reimagined front. I think there are some things that make some sense, but at the same time, I mean, we have a really broken system. And I mean, those who are service providers, those who are in enforcement, those who are in the community. Again, we're not getting great results for what we've been doing over time, whether we're talking about the war on drugs, which winds up being a war on people
Right.
Yes.
who actually need that help. And I'll be remiss if I didn't mention this. Years ago, you had someone like former Mayor Kurt Schmoke who talked about looking at addiction and substance abuse as a health issue, and he was lambasted for that. And
That's
now,
right.
decades later, folks have come around and say, you know what, you had a good point. But the insidious part about that is because the opioid epidemic, if you will, has touched communities that are largely white and suburban and rural. Now there's more attention to an issue that was seen as an inner city, predominantly Black and brown issue.
That's right. That's right. Suddenly it's a crisis, right? Been a crisis for decades and longer, and yet suddenly it is now. Let's take some Q&A, and I'll pose this to some of you. I ask others to, of course, jump in. Here's one from someone observing today. How do we move from fear-based policing? Maybe I'll start with you, Lieutenant Colonel Brown. How do we move from fear-based policing, and how do we move beyond the belief that a young Black man is inherently dangerous, something that's baked into the cake, as Dr. Daniels reflected earlier?
So one of the things that I would say is, if we're in reform, the Baltimore Police Department, we are. And I think that as transparent as we can be, we still have to make everything relational. We need conversation. We need, engagement. And I say that to say, if it is an opportunity that you can take to have a conversation with us, please do. Sometimes that we are, what I'm hearing from our officers now with the road that we are definitely going toward, when we are, trying to engage, some community, rightfully so, are still very, apprehensive. And do I have a conversation? I'm not really sure if I really want to talk to the police. Okay, so what do you want? Because of course, in past practice, most of the time that engagement led to, some other criminality that we may have been observing or, appearing to observe. So I would just say that, hey, listen, walk this walk with us. We're going through reform. Be as open, of course, still be apprehensive, but please know that we are changing. And a lot of our young people, I think Dr. Daniel said it the best when he was doing his research and for the consent decree. Listen, what he heard on both sides of the fence was we want the same things. We're very similar in what it is that how our lifestyles may be, how our family structure may be. I don't think that it's something that we should just look to say, hey, listen, only Black and brown families are affected by drugs, right? Because we do have very prominent and very well citizens that are very well off, that really needs our help and will always ask for our help. So I would just say, just walk along the walk with us. We are similar. Have that conversation. You may be surprised. I mean, that we are alike and we may have a lot of similarity in lifestyle. We're just on this side of profession, not necessarily on in any other one, but we have a lot of reform efforts that's definitely going on.
And I like what was said in the, even in the George Floyd trial, in closing arguments, we again, when you talk to community, people are not anti-police as much as they are concerned about accountability. We know, even in the research that I did in 2019 and 2020, we know it's not everybody. We know that, we understand that. But again, what happens with accountability and people not being held accountable, and even when you look at the court case, some say, well, I was more excited about the fact of accountability. Of course, accountability leads to justice. But again, there's always this cautious optimism and apprehension, even in in the process of even in this very case itself, and what could happen next. And so you start to see that cautious level of optimism. But again, one of the things that I'm very clear about in my research is that I did not find people across all generations that were anti-police as much as they were needing accountability in this space. And yes, and this week represented, even if it's incremental, it represented a bit of accountability or a bit of excitement.
Thank you, Dr. Daniels, and thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Brown. I knew from the very beginning that I would wish that we had far more time. Let me turn to,
Can I
you,
address that
Mr.
before we
Huffman.
move on?
Sure, and I have the next question for you, but why don't you start? Go ahead.
I read that question. I recognize the gentleman who wrote that question into the chat, and I just want to highlight the fact that when he was speaking about fear-based policing, his question was, how do we get officers not to engage in fear-based policing? And I just wanted to respond to that very quickly, is that we have to recognize that officers are being recruited from among the rest of us, right? And so just as we have both explicit and implicit biases, so do officers, right? And so they go into their professions with their own explicit and implicit biases. We've all been raised in this white dominant, white privileged culture, which sets up a pecking order about whose property and safety am I supposed to be policing and controlling, and who is the threat. And so we have to understand that a lot of officers come into the institution of policing with that mindset. And so the attempt has been to try to train officers out of that mindset, helping them recognize their own explicit and implicit biases, and then figure out ways not to let that drive how it is they engage in policing, but also recognize that that's very hard to do. It is very hard to rewire your brain to think about a certain group of people in a different way. And I am being asked to learn how to do this when I've got a sidearm and state-sponsored lethal force. And so if I get into a conflict with someone that I have been socialized to believe is a threat simply because of their race, their ethnicity, the community they come from, that is likely to override whatever training I may be currently under, because now I feel like I'm in a life and death situation and I have to protect myself. And so I'm not saying that we don't stop training officers and exposing officers to this implicit bias training. We just, first of all, have to recognize it's going to take more than just a 40-hour training, right? This is something that's going to be over time. And then it goes back to, who do we recruiting into the police force in the first instance? What upfront work are we doing to try to identify what the biases these individuals have for us to even make the question, do we even want this person to be a police officer? Or do we need to redirect them to some other profession because we just don't want that here? And then the last piece I would offer, which is something that Dr. Daniels and Lieutenant Colonel Brown already said, which is this whole idea of, why are we, and I'm using the universal we, why are we calling the police in the first instance? There are things that we are asking the police to do, communities and individuals that we're asking the police to engage in, which for all the reasons that we just said, plus the reasons that are individual to the person who's being confronted by the police, we just don't need the police there. We don't need police confronting a young person who is in the throes of adolescence. We need that community-based organization that Lieutenant Colonel Brown talked about. We don't need the police confronting someone who's in the midst of a mental health episode. We need trained mental health professionals engaging with those people. And so this is where we have to talk about, yes, what are the alternatives to calling 911? How do the universal we retrain ourselves that the police and 911 don't become the default whenever we see something happening that makes us uncomfortable or that we don't like? And how do we decriminalize behaviors and conduct that we have criminalized, that have a disproportionate effect on certain populations of people, so that the officers are not even expected to engage? with that individual, because we've said that it's not a crime to sleep on the park bench. It's not a crime to be under the bridge. It's not a crime to cuss out an officer, right? That's not a crime, right? And so how do we go about, it's not a crime if I choose to sell my body, right? Because I'm trying to survive. You might not like it. You might have a moral argument against it, but we're not asking the criminal justice system to do something about that. And so we have to tackle these things on so many dimensions. And the movement for reform, replacement, dismantling, whichever way you come in this, we have to know how to multitask, right? We have to do all of these things at the same time, because that is what it's going to take to solve this, what we all agree is a problem.
Thank you so much for that, Tara Huffman, and that fear-based framework that you're talking about, and you've referenced that it's beyond just policing, right? And it has to do with who is it that we're calling. I think many of us, I know our own organization, are having these conversations just about our own security framework. What does it mean to identify someone as a threat when they come into our buildings, when maybe they're upset because of an underlying mental illness, or because of some horrible trauma that's happened to them just before they walked into our facility? How are we preparing our own organizations to think beyond that fear-based framework? Let's get back into this idea with you, Tara Huffman. When we think about the idea of retributive justice as a response to a criminal act committed against the state, seldom do we picture that it's the servant of the state that violates the state, as was powerfully on display over the last 11 months and 2 days ago. Although Tuesday's verdict demonstrated this reality, we don't have to travel all the way to Minnesota. It was on April 12th, 2015, 6 years ago, here in Baltimore, where we ultimately saw this play out with Freddie Gray, who died at the untimely age of 25. In the case of Freddie Gray, the city reached a $6.4 million settlement with Gray's family, and the former mayor drew both praise and criticism for this act. As we know, Baltimore now has entered into a consent decree to enact widespread reform in the criminal justice system. As an individual who was involved in criminal justice initiatives during the time of and related to the death of Freddie Gray, do you feel that these aforementioned approaches align with the tenets of restorative justice? What gaps exist in addressing the societal harms that were caused as a result of Gray's death?
Align might be the best word, not on the nose of, certainly not on the nose of restorative justice. And with some elements of retributive justice, right? Just going the other way. When we think of restorative justice, and I'm still a student of restorative justice, and so I don't pretend to know everything about restorative justice, but what restorative justice doesn't ask what is the proportional punishment for a particular thing. Restorative justice asks, how has the survivor or the target of the harm been harmed? And what does he or she require to be made whole? And how do I hold the person who created the harm accountable, but also ask, what was going on with them that led them to commit the harm in the first place, and where may they need to be made whole in some respect? And that becomes a conversation between the person who was harmed and the person who did the harm, and not necessarily that conversation is not mediated by the state, right? That's a conversation that can happen one-on-one, because your definition that retributive justice is someone being held accountable for something they committed against the state, not against the person or the family or the community. And so I have had conversations with folks who were victims of crime who are just as dissatisfied with the outcome of the case maybe more dissatisfied with the outcome of the case, because it's almost like the prosecuting attorney just went off and no one ever asked them, what would make you be okay at the end of this? How have you been harmed? Where can I connect you with resources and services? And what outcome of this case would make you feel like you've been heard, and that you are on your way to being made whole? Instead, we've got these laws on the books and we have assigned, right? 10 years for this, 5 years for this, a minimum of 20 for this, right? A maximum of 40 for this. Whereas you may have a victim, particularly in a community of color, who may be saying, my son is dead, but I'm not trying to have somebody else's son die in prison. Like, that's not justice for me. My definition of being restored looks like this for me. And I have enough with me and enough in me and enough experience in my community to understand that that other individual needs some restoration too. And I'm willing to engage in that conversation, but our current system does not make room for that. In fact, there are many ways in which our current system rejects that, right? We do our best to keep the victim and the person who committed the crime as far away from each other as possible, never asking the person who suffered the harm, what do you want? What do you need? And so, and I see Dr. Daniels, he and I are both trained we are both trained community conference facilitators. We are trained in a process that brings the person who suffered the harm into a conversation or a circle with the person who did the harm, and with their respective supporters, to have a conversation about what happened. Why did it happen? What is the harm that was done? And how do we walk away from this where people are on their way to being restored, right? We're not going to get to restoration in the conversation, but we can put together a plan with concrete, actionable steps. Now, people may think, well, yeah, you can do that, you know, with something minor. No, there are nations who do this with the major stuff as well. And we could replicate that right here in the United States. But again, that back to totally reimagine, it takes a complete reimagining and a complete shift in the way we think about justice and how we center the person who experienced the harm in a way that we're not centering them right now. And we prioritize restoration, reconnection where it's possible. It may not always be possible, but to at least make room for it and make that becomes our new default. Right now, our default is prosecution, conviction, you know, through a guilty plea, time in prison, get out on the other side, and then we run into what Councilman Bullock was like, and then how do we restore that person once they re-enter the community? That's our current default. How do we make it our default is that, no, we're seeking restoration. We're not seeking retribution. We're not seeking revenge. And we're not defining justice as how many years the person gets sentenced to, and how hard a time did they do while they were in that prison. But we have a different definition of justice that is very person-based, very heart-based, and it is focused on restoration and maybe reparations where it may be needed. Well,
yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. A new default. Thank you, Tara Huffman. Let's put our fourth poll up on the screen here. A loaded question poll, perhaps. Riots could be avoided if. Choose all that apply. Elected officials were censured for using inciting rhetoric. Protesters were able to focus their energy on being gainfully employed. Using the term riot creates a false narrative in all contexts. Voicelessness among the disempowered was addressed. Riots cannot be avoided amid so much social unrest, or none of the above. We're battling out here between false narrative and voicelessness among the disempowered. All right, let's turn again to you, Lieutenant Colonel Brown. There we go. There's the Final poll results. Since this is the 6th anniversary of the passing of Freddie Gray, I want to stay on this subject for a minute. In 1966, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stated that, quote, "The riot is the language of those who are unheard." We hear this repeated often, right? 55 years later, we hear it repeated often because this statement in many ways still holds true. For 2 weeks following Gray's death, citizens protested, so-called riots broke out. Countless individuals were arrested or injured, businesses were destroyed. Who's to blame for this situation? What are the various harms that were done? And ultimately, what does restorative justice and healing, this kind of new baseline that Tara Huffman is discussing, what does it look like in this context?
Well, certainly, the police department has to accept accountability and responsibility for, Freddie Gray's death. We had, he died in our custody. We should have done more to make sure that we safeguarded his life, made sure that he was safe, when we placed him in the back of the wagon. And I think that that's something that we most certainly have to always make sure that we recognize that at that moment we had a failed process. And at the end of that, someone lost their life. That's not okay for most to accept and recognize and say, hey, listen, we did something that was harmful to someone, and ultimately he lost his life. But what we've also learned is that we needed more effective training. We needed better equipment. We were not as prepared as an agency as we thought we were. We were thinking that the training that we were going through really was efficient, and it wasn't. So we had failed training systems, as I think everyone has already spoke about here. How do we change bad systems and make sure that they are for the betterment, not just for the agency, because we're forward facing to our community. Our community deserves better, and even some inequity in our poor neighborhoods, they're calling for more of an outcry for resources. And all too often we are called to handle every single call. And we should not be. We shouldn't be there as the social worker. We shouldn't be there as the mental health therapist. We should not be there as a parent to young kids that is involved in risky behavior. Because what that does is forces us somewhat in negative engagements. And even when it comes down to some of the environmental issues and concerns of a neighborhood, right? Listen, if my lights are out, I don't need you as the police to come. I need city services to come and replace the light. We'll come with public safety lenses to think that how do we safeguard a community? But actually what we're doing is over-policing a community when the need for them was not police. And then, we just have to we had to really internalize and look at ourselves when the riots happened in 2015. We had so many destroyed relationships because of that. Communities no longer trusted us. It didn't make a difference if we had good relationship already with community individually as officers. But when they looked at our legitimacy and our efficacy, it's like, how do we trust you to keep any of us safe if you can't keep, and you could not keep one person safe? And I think that we just have to, also recognize that restorative justice for us and the way that our community is looking, officers have to be held accountable for their actions, period. And we need the criminal justice system to make sure that they are holding us accountable when we are involved in incidences like this. I mean, I think even though I know we're talking about Freddie Gray, let's talk about George Floyd. I think all of us had a sigh of relief. And I'm saying for myself as a Black woman, a Black mom, a Black grandmom, I have a son, I have a grandson, I have brothers, I have nephews. Very well, in any instance, it could be them. So that's very important to make sure that we are being held accountable when we are doing things that we should not do. And I just think that, we're still working very, very hard with a lot of our reform, a lot of our community engagement. We're trying to right all of those wrongs. And we're trying to make sure that we are producing better product throughout our training, and throughout our process for screening for, new officers as they're coming on board. But ultimately, at the end, I think the way that restorative justice and healing looks like, we as officers, when we do things that are not right, we're being held accountable.
Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Brown. Dr. Daniels, I'd like to give you the opportunity to respond to Lieutenant Colonel Brown.
Well, I mean, of course, she's one of my favorite lieutenants. So how in the world am I going to come behind her? Again, I think I think that what she said is just critical. I thank you for your transparency, and all of those are elements that go into rebuilding trust for community. And I heard people talk about also training for police officers. However, there also needs to be training for communities as well. As we begin to, and that's what we did. We talked about training for communities, and then we brought those two groups together so that there could be a conversation that needed to take place. But again, restorative justice, when you look at what led into the consent decree, the impetus was for zero tolerance policies. None of that has ever been restored. None of that has ever been, none of that restoration. We still are in the residue of a tale of two cities. All of those kind of practices that take place, whether black butterfly or white L, all of those things that take place, it needs restoration. And we understand that it may not have happened on the watch of some of our current councilmen and or police officers. But again, it is so historical. It is so historical that it becomes something that we have to embark upon together. I'm arguing a full comprehensive approach, not just navigating criminality as well, but I'm also a part of the Social Determinants of Health Committee. When you look at economic stability, neighborhood and built physical environments, education, food deserts, community context, and also the healthcare system. All of those are apparatuses and categories that must coexist simultaneously as we start talking about restoration and looking at alternatives. We've got to fix the broken window theory. We've got to be able to do that. And I love what Councilman Bullock is doing in his district. I watch it very closely. Rebuilding, all of that becomes important. Faith leaders. I challenge faith leaders. I challenge all of them. I'm the chair of Civic Action. I challenge them. We must get back to what it means for community to serve the needs of community in our 2,000 faith institutions across the city.
Thank you, Dr. Daniels. And yes, so many of us at Healthcare for the Homeless know so many people who spent so much time in jail because of so-called broken window theory of policing. Really appreciate those thoughts. I want to do a quick check-in with our panelists. As we suspected might be the case, we are extremely short on time. I can drive us toward completion, but want to ask if there is permission to continue until 3:10, 10 minutes over. If you cannot, let me know, and we will not go in that direction. If you can, we will continue with the questions as we have them programmed.
I apologize, Kevin, but I have a hard stop at 3.
Okay. Then we're gonna move toward a closure as planned.
I mean, don't let me stop the conversation. My fellow panelists are rocking it, and so I will contribute up for another 8 minutes, and then if I need to just slide on out, that's what I'll do.
Is that okay with others?
Yep, that's perfect.
All right, then let's put up our next poll here. And we're getting into some rapid fire questions. If taking a person's biological material without their consent would save millions of lives, including a loved one, would the ends justify the means? Would the ends justify the means? Seeing a small percentage on the yes and a more than 80% so far on the no. A particularly relevant question here in Baltimore in the healthcare community with respect to the late Henrietta Lacks. Let's move to some rapid fire questions, about 90 seconds here. Lieutenant Colonel Brown and Dr. Daniels for this first one. When Henrietta Lacks battled an aggressive form of cervical cancer, cells were stolen from her body without her knowledge. Since then, these cells, called immortal by a book, these HeLa cells have led to profound medical breakthroughs and generated wealth and fame for prominent medical institutions. Only after several decades did her family find out about the usage of Lacks cells, but without recompense. Just last year, donors have begun to provide funds to the Families Foundation. Do the ends justify the means? What does restorative justice, Lieutenant Colonel Brown, look like in this context?
So first I would say the end never justifies the means, because every action causes a reaction. I think that, of course, all of us have to pay the cost in some type of way that it has affected our family. Granted, her cells were used to do some great research for us, but ultimately, I think that the family should have been, conferred with. It should have been they should have asked permission. That would be like any one of us, someone just taking anything from us and just doing as they please. Growing up in East Baltimore, I can tell you the stories that my grandmother told me is this was common practice for them, for the hospital at that time. So I would say it's disheartening, right? So you hear it and it's no longer that, hey, listen, it's just a myth with them doing certain research on people that they felt as though, hey, no one would ever find out. But now it's been proven in this fact. So I would just think that, her family should have been informed. They definitely should be compensated. And we just have to look at it to be how the direct cost has an effect. Granted, again, it's some great opportunities that has come out of it, but still the family should have been conferred and definitely should have been given the opportunity to make a decision on if that is what they wanted or not.
Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Brown. I'll turn to you, Dr. Daniels, and then I'll have another question for you right before you have to leave, Tara. So you'll get the last word before the 3 o'clock hour. Dr. Daniels.
I agree. I concur with everything Lieutenant Brown talked about, particularly when you start to talk about none of it justifies the mean. When you start to talk about constitutionally, dignity, privacy, all of those kind of things should be apportioned to every person. And even when you talk about the ultimate goal of restorative justice, it is not just repair, encountering the other, but it is also about transformation. I can't tell you, I'm with a hospital now in trying to promote and or at least educate about the COVID vaccine. It is difficult. It continues to be difficult in the throngs of this level of repair that is happening with Henrietta Lacks. We know that there is some policy that is happening on the federal level, but again, you still talk about trust is something that is built over time, not instantaneously. It takes time to build trust, and everybody pays for the lack of trust.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Daniels. This next question for Ms. Tara Huffman and Councilman Bullock. We continue to tout reform in all our current systems and practices, whether it's reforming the criminal justice system, the housing system, the healthcare system. We use justice pretty elastically, that word. However, what happens if the very foundations of our systems were built, and in fact are built, on a white supremacist culture baked in from the beginning to give advantage to some and disadvantage to others, where racial inequities that lead to homelessness, health disparities, and criminal activity are continuously perpetuated. So much so, as you mentioned earlier, Tara Huffman, to seek justice is to perpetuate racism. Is reform enough in these systems? If not, what if we reimagined restorative justice in a manner that identified that structural racism is the actual crime and the offense in these contexts? Who then are the victims? And what does restoration now entail?
So as I said at the top of my remarks, I'm a recovering reformist. That is not how I describe myself anymore. And I think recovery, even though I've never had to recover from a substance use addiction or any other addiction, I know enough about the recovery process to know it's something that takes some time, because every once in a while you fall back, right? You can fall back, you can be tempted back. And so there are times when I'm tempted back. Yeah, I have to stop, wait, what are you doing? Are you reforming? Or are you transforming? Is this thing, as a program officer with a local foundation that has a focus on the justice system, I have evolved to the place where before I invest in any proposed intervention, campaign, solution, I sit down and I say, okay, wait a minute, will this thing reform, tinker around the edges of what exists? Or will this thing go towards completely reimagining, dismantling what is, completely reimagining how we do this, and not rely on our default response? And I think that's just, it's, people hear words like same as me, abolition, dismantle, right? It sounds so drastic and unnecessary if you have never been harmed by the current justice system. If you don't have a personal negative relationship with the justice system, you haven't had negative encounters with the police, right? You never felt like you were mistreated if you were, first of all, have you ever been in a courtroom? And then if you have been in a courtroom, did you feel like you were mistreated or did you feel like you were respected? You've never been in jail, you've never been in prison. And so from where you sit, everything seems to be working okay. And there may be some problems, but surely there are solutions, right? And so I recognize that we as a nation, right, we incarcerate more of our own than any other nation in the world. And we keep our people in prison longer than any other nation in the world. And we're the only nation that incarcerates our own children at the rate that we incarcerate them. And so we, from our birth, have been fed a steady diet of this is what it looks like, this is what justice looks like. And there's some problems here or there and they can be fixed. And I think that even what we're seeing across the nation is an awakening of finally a critical mass of Americans of all races, creeds, and colors who are coming to the recognition of what this justice system, this housing system, this welfare system, what these systems really are, what their origins really are, and that they're not serving all of us in the way that they should, and therefore we need to rethink it. We don't know where to start, right? So I'm gonna get out here in March. I don't know what I'm gonna do after the march, but dang it, I'm a march right now, right? And then hopefully somebody will point me in the right direction. This is gonna take time. This is something that is centuries in the making, and we're not going to dismantle it and reimagine it and replace it in a few years. But we gotta be willing to be in it for the long haul and sit with the discomfort, sit with the tension, sit with the conflict long enough for us to push through to the other side. I remain hopeful, I remain optimistic. Sometimes I get tired, absolutely I get tired, but I see our numbers growing. And I think as the numbers grow, then the ideas will also come. And more importantly, we'll have the energy and the numbers that we need to actually push those ideas forward so that we can get to the other side. Whatever's waiting for us on the other side, we don't know, but we just pray it's better than what we got right now.
Tara Huffman with the Open Society Institute, abolitionist, recovering reformer, powerful attorney, and thank you so much for spending time with us today.
I think she can stay to 3:10.
Bye-bye.
Councilman John Bullock, let's turn to you with that question. Is reform enough? What if we reimagined restorative justice in a way that identified structural racism as the actual crime and offense in these contexts? Who are the victims? What does restoration now entail?
Right. I mean, I love the way that you framed this question. I really enjoyed this conversation. There are a couple of things that really come to mind, even when we were talking about the issue of consent and how that relates to trust and trust being broken. And Dr. Daniels knows this. As researchers, there are certain ethical standards that we're supposed to abide by. And those are also things that that Lieutenant Colonel Brown mentioned. And I would be remiss to mention, she talked about not being fearful. She ain't afraid of nobody, right? I mean, I love her in terms of what that means in terms of restoring relationships and having people who understand the community, have love for the community, being part of it. You also made reference to, Dr. King, one of our great fraternity brothers, talking about, riot is the language of the unheard. But one thing I'll also go back to is even looking at the unrest in the 1960s and the Kerner Commission, which was formed to analyze what caused this? And they looked at the reality is that there were two societies, one white, one black, separate and unequal. And we're talking about places in the North. We're talking about, Harlem and Baltimore and Chicago and Detroit. And the reality is all those issues around inequalities as it relates to housing, unemployment, incarceration, education. So if we are going to reform the system, it really means to take a really sharp needle to those points. And one of the things I love as an educator is being able to have students confront these issues. In order to really deal with this, we have to be very explicit and very honest about what the challenges have been historically in order to address it, right? So when you go to a doctor, you can't hide your illness if you want it to be addressed. So we have to nakedly address those issues, honestly, educate folks. And the great thing about this conversation, which I'm really inspired by, is the fact is we have to cut across racial lines, class lines, geographic lines. Because the reality is this is an issue just of people of color. This is an issue for all of us. And all of us have to be at the table to be able to engage one another and make sure that we're actually drilling down this issue and confronting the realities that are facing us. So again, I thank you for the opportunity. I look forward to engaging with all the people on this panel as we continue to do this work in Baltimore and beyond. So bless you all for the work you're doing.
Thank you so much, Councilman Bullock. Final question, 1 minute for every panelist. If you could equip participants with one tangible way that they can integrate the principles of restorative justice into their work or livelihood to repair harm and promote community healing, what would it be and why? There's 2 remaining. Lieutenant Colonel Brown, let's go to you.
So again, thank you for the opportunity for this great discussion today. And I'll be very quick. One word: humility. Always remain humble. Golden rule: always treat others the way that you will want others to treat you. That's just my foundation. That's all in my heart. That's all in my passion. And I would just say, take that in all of the work that you do.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel. Dr. Daniels, one tangible thing.
Accountability. And that's just not accountability of officers, but that is accountability of we as community as well. I'm out with the brothers, We Our Us Men's movement, all of that, the Kioba brothers. We're building real estate for families. We're working with young men to do that. This is, Heather McGee said it, this is all of our problem at this point. It may not have been our fault, but it's our problem to deal with.
Thank you. It may not be our fault, but it is our problem. Please join me in thanking Bishop Kevin Daniels, Associate Professor at Morgan State University, pastor of St. Martin's Church of Christ, Monique Brown, Lieutenant Colonel with the Baltimore City Police Department, Tara Andrews Huffman, lawyer and director of the Criminal and Juvenile Justice Program at the Open Society Institute-Baltimore, and Councilman John T. Bullock, representing the 9th District. Thank you all for being here, for leaning into this conversation. We asked you to speak at the intersection of the personal and the professional, and you have more than done that. To our community of practice participants and all of us, here's the homework before the next session. Part 2 of this session, Reimagining Restorative Justice, will take place on June 3rd. You have the opportunity in the chat box to click the link and register for it. Do the work between now and then. If you've not already done so, consider how you work to integrate the principles of restorative justice into your organizations, into your livelihood, to eliminate interpersonal and institutional racism, repair harm, and promote community healing. Apply a racial equity lens to your work, the work of your agency. Think concretely. Develop the capacity to understand that it's not enough to be not racist. Not enough to be not racist, but that we all must be anti-racist in our thoughts, in our actions, in our work. Only then can we truly start addressing racial inequities in various contexts, this process that we've all been discussing today. However, it starts internally and even at home, well before we arrive at work. Look for our next Community of Practice invitation, which will focus on reimagining restorative justice through the lens of structural racism, Part 2. A survey will be sent out immediately after this call. We ask that you fill it out. We learn from and benefit from your feedback. It makes future conversations even better. A key part of a community of practice on homelessness is to have a way of contacting each other. So we're going to distribute your information unless you would like to opt out. If you'd like to opt out, please notify communications at hchmd.org by the end of the day on Friday so that we can distribute the list to everybody. Thank you to our panelists and to all of you for joining us for this important conversation. Happy Thursday and good afternoon.
Take care, everybody.